Welcome to the SAFeTY Chronicles, exploring how to keep people and pets safe from the cycle of interpersonal violence. I am your host, Allie Phillips, founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the SAFeTY Program, a nonprofit organization working with domestic violence shelters to eliminate the pet housing barrier to safety. As the founder, I have led the global movement in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing while elevating the criminal justice response to how animal abuse links to crimes against people. I am a former prosecuting attorney, internationally recognized legal expert and public speaker, award-winning author, and advocate for protecting vulnerable victims. In this podcast, we will explore how and why animals are harmed in the cycle of family violence and the human-animal bond that keeps victims in harm's way with their pets. Guest speakers and I will share strategies for shelters and professionals working to safeguard survivors, why pet-inclusive sheltering is life-saving, and safety tips for those who need help. None of the content will be graphic. If you are in harm's way, please contact your nearest domestic violence shelter or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Let's get started. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the next episode in the SAFeTY Chronicles. I have my cup of joe here in my cat coffee cup, and I am ready to talk about important partners in the SAFeTY program. So, in the SAFeTY Startup Manual, that is a free resource to domestic violence shelters. It's a wonderful, wonderful workbook with, oh my gosh, decades of information in it. But in the manual, there are 4 essential policies, and I want to talk about 3 of them today. Okay, so when a domestic violence shelter starts a SAFeTY program of housing pets on site, it is only as successful as the partners that support them. And the partners that best support a domestic violence shelter SAFeTY program are an animal protection organization, whether it's a shelter or a rescue organization, and a veterinarian. Okay, so why is this important? So number 1, we do not ask domestic violence shelters to become animal experts. They are experts in housing people of domestic violence and providing for their needs. And we do not want a domestic violence shelter ever to think that they have to take on more responsibilities or learn skills about sheltering animals when it's really not necessary. Bringing in an animal partner will support in providing for the housing and the needs of the animal residents. Now, they're not going to do it, but they're there to support should an issue arise. Number 2, we do not ask domestic violence shelters to provide the day-to-day care for the animals. It's really important, and this is a core policy. It is important for the pet owner to care for their pet. They need to feed them, clean up after them, give them outdoor time. And that all needs to be provided by the pet owner because it provides normalcy in their life when their life has literally been turned upside down. And it's safety. It provides a safety reason because even if a cat or a dog or a rabbit or a bird, whatever the animal is on site, even if they appear calm and happy, you may not know the full extent of the trauma that they experienced in the home. And so this is why the pet owner provides all the care. So that eliminates bites and scratches and any sort of injuries. Okay. Now, of course, each shelter should have a SAFeTY program director that would monitor and make sure each pet on site is being properly taken care of. And that is where having an animal protection partner is important to understand what is the level of care, what's the minimum care that a shelter resident should be providing to their pet. And then number 3, we do not ask a domestic violence shelter to help with behavioral or medical issues of an animal. It's really important to have an animal expert on standby if there is an issue with that. You know, if an animal is behaving aggressively, is it really aggression? Or could it be stress from being in shelter? Could it be trauma from abuse and neglect that they experienced? That's not for the domestic violence shelter to figure out. That's for your animal protection partner to help with. They're also there to help with, if there's excessive vocalizing. This is why I like housing option number one, which I've already talked about in a prior episode, because when animals are with their family in the room that they're living in, vocalizing is going to be less, but this is where a shelter can help out. They can also help if there's medical issues. So before I go on and talk about how animal protection organizations and veterinarians can help, if you like the concept of the SAFeTY program in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing for survivors of domestic violence, then please click the subscribe button for this podcast. Post a comment about what you most liked about this episode. Visit safetyprogram.org to donate to support our efforts, and reach out to a domestic violence shelter in your community and let them know about the SAFeTY program. All right, so let's talk about how animal protection organizations can help. The more companion animals that can stay with their families, even in a domestic violence shelter, the better it is for the family, for the animal, and for the animal shelter. Animal shelters are often overcrowded, and housing a pet of domestic violence takes up space in the shelter, limits animals who need to come in, who don't have families, who are truly homeless, or maybe have been seized in an animal abuse or animal neglect investigation. And so there is a solution. And this is where the domestic violence shelters allow the pets to stay on site and alleviate that burden off of the animal shelters. Okay, so this is where an animal protection shelter, if you work for one or volunteer for one, get with your local domestic violence shelter. Especially if you are housing their pets, let's have a conversation. You, the domestic violence shelter, and me will have a conversation about how to put the pets on site, and then that's going to alleviate the burden in your animal shelter. Now, animal protection organizations can also advise about creating pet housing setup. Like, what should the setup look like at the domestic violence shelter? The SAFeTY program has 4 different housing options, and this is where you can come in with your expertise in setting up an animal shelter. You can advise the domestic violence shelter about local regulations, local ordinances. You can be there to assist when a situation arises, such as behavioral issues, of an animal that's behaving stressed or aggressive. When animals are being noisy and disrupting other residents. Maybe the resident coming in has too many pets. Maybe they have 6 dogs and 10 cats, and the domestic violence shelter can only house half of them. You can be there on backup to help house those animals. Or maybe there are animals that just simply physically cannot be housed at a domestic violence shelter. Maybe it's horses or farm animals. And then the animal protection organization can also be there to provide animal care education, to come in and provide education to the pet owner about proper pet care. Maybe they've never been given that information. Maybe it's never been modeled to them. Or maybe you can come in if you have a humane education program for kids, because if there are children coming out of a domestic violence home where there has been domestic violence or child abuse, along with animal abuse, they may need humane education to learn how to properly care for animals, as well as safely interact with them in a very loving, humane way. And so these are ways that an animal protection organization can actually support the efforts of the domestic violence shelter. Now, an animal protection organization may also have veterinary services on site at the animal shelter. So that sort of medical care could be just a general wellness exam upon intake of the animal, vaccinations, spaying and neutering, flea and parasite treatment, grooming, nail clipping, that sort of thing. And also any medical care due to abuse or neglect. So there's a lot of different ways that a veterinary partner can help and just be that backup when the domestic violence shelter has an animal related question. They know who to call to get professional advice. Now, in the SAFeTY Startup Manual, there is an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, that can be signed between the domestic violence shelter and the animal protection shelter. And it's where you can tweak it, you can get the Word version of the document from me, and you can edit it to outline what you all are willing to provide to each other. So, this is something where you come into agreement and you work together. And it's a win-win for everybody, because the animal shelter doesn't necessarily want to house pets of domestic violence when there is a family. They want to keep you together. So this is a win-win for everybody. All right, now let's talk about how veterinarians can help. So the veterinarians that I talk to, not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world, they love the concept of the SAFeTY program. So approach your local veterinarian and ask if they would be interested in being your SAFeTY program veterinarian. Now, they may wonder, okay, what's in it for me? Well, you could certainly offer free advertising to them in exchange for their services, either pro bono services or low-cost services. You could put their information all over your social media pages, on your website. You could have a plaque at your domestic violence shelter that says, Dr. Jane Doe is the SAFeTY program veterinarian for the shelter. Plus, the families who are going to benefit from the veterinary care may continue with the veterinarian once they get into their own housing. So it's a win-win for everybody. And this partnership is really important because if a client comes into the domestic violence shelter with an injured pet, that is not the time that you go searching for a veterinarian. You need to know ahead of time, who can I go to? Who is going to work with me, especially on an emergency basis? Now, I hear throughout the SAFeTY community that veterinarians are being very generous, and they're offering free on-site wellness checks. So the veterinarian, either once a week or twice a week, depending on the size of the shelter and the number of intakes each week, they're coming on site to the domestic violence shelter to provide wellness checks, vaccinations, flea and parasite treatment, grooming, nail clippings, basic medication, and they are overwhelmingly doing this at no cost. Now, if a pet needs spaying and neutering or emergency medical care due to abuse and neglect, they may need surgery, x-rays, additional medication. This is what you negotiate ahead of time through a memorandum of understanding to negotiate reduced rates. Now, this partnership with a veterinarian is also important should the need arise for veterinary expert testimony. Maybe it's in a criminal domestic violence case or a felony assault case or a civil case involving divorce or pet custody. So you'll have this veterinarian who can testify as an expert when they did the initial wellness check. And they can say this animal had these injuries or this level of neglect. Okay, so that is really important. Now, at the SAFeTY program, we encourage domestic violence shelters to create a veterinary fund. You can do it through fundraising, through social media posts, and it's having just a little bucket of money in case if a shelter resident doesn't have the funds to pay for veterinary expenses. And, I see many shelters utilizing social media in specific cases. And I'm going to talk about fundraising in another podcast, but they're using social media to say, and of course they are, disguising identities, but, they're posting, hey, we are about ready to intake a dog who was chronically abused and neglected and has a broken leg, and we need money to pay for the veterinary bills. We're looking for $500 or $1,000, and people love to donate to that. Something very, very specific. They feel like they can help in a situation where they otherwise feel helpless. And so like I said, I'm going to dive into fundraising in a future podcast that's coming up, because you're going to tap in to a client base of donors that you've never had. And it's the people who love animals, and people who love animals donate. So when you're talking with a veterinarian and asking them if they will be your SAFeTY Program veterinarian, you can certainly offer them, your digital copy of the SAFeTY Startup Manual so that they can read about the program. They fully understand the importance of housing people and pets together and how it is a solution to link related crimes where animal abuse links with domestic violence, child abuse, and even elder abuse. Now, one last thing. You can always collaborate with fundraisers and events to raise awareness, and you can work together. A lot of animal shelters and animal protection rescue groups have annual fundraisers. They may do dog walks or, just other events, and you could partner together. So the High Desert Domestic Violence Program in Victorville, California, goes to their animal protection partner events to hand out flyers about the shelter, to raise awareness that they accept pets on site, to educate about the link between animal abuse and domestic violence. And it's a win-win for everybody when you work together and you collaborate and partner. And it just gets the information out in the community. Okay, so in conclusion, if you work at a veterinary clinic, if you work at an animal protection shelter or volunteer with an animal protection organization, would you please do me a favor? Ask your local domestic violence shelter if they are housing animals on site. If they are, if you're able to offer any help, please offer. Let them know that you are there as a support. If the domestic violence shelter is not housing pets on site, please ask them if they would be interested in having a conversation about it. I can send them the SAFeTY Startup Manual, and I can get on a Zoom call with them, and you are welcome to get on the Zoom call with me, because the more that we work together and collaborate, the safer the communities are going to be. All right, thanks for listening, and please post a comment below about what you liked most about this episode. All right, take care, everybody. If you are in harm's way and need help, please visit the Pet Inclusive Shelter listing at safetyprogram.org, call your nearest domestic violence shelter, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Want to support our efforts and help us keep the SAFeTY Startup Manual free for domestic violence shelters? Consider donating at safetyprogram.org/donate. Your donation saves lives.